Well, thank you. And let me just give a tiny bit of background about myself. As you could see from the previous slide, I'm a professor at the Johns Hopkins Carey Business School. I've been with Johns Hopkins for a little over a quarter century. Back in 1996, I initially joined the School of Public Health. I was in the Department of Health Policy and Management as a health economist. Spent 16 years there building up my career in academia, going through any number of stresses, working with some really great mentors, and learning how to mentor doctoral students and PhD students and junior faculty along the way. After 16 years in a variety of leadership roles in the School of Public Health, I had the opportunity as a health economist to look somewhere else within the university. That brought me to the business school, 8.5 years as Vice Dean for Education, leading a team that grew from 30 to 70, focused on personal and professional development for that team, in addition to then learning how to mentor MBA students and junior faculty in a business school. I gave my first talk on mentoring as a TEDx talk in 2017, given a bunch since then, and as part of coming off of my administrative role and back to faculty and research, not only want to do the mentoring and continue to improve how I mentor, but also contribute to the research on mentoring as we move forward. So as you can tell from what I've already told you, it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Lots of the things that have been said already will be things that you hear again, but with some elaboration and fitting it all together in what I'll speak about today. And just my collaboration with Dragonfly, I never had any personal significant mental health issues, but there have been multiple times in my life where I have felt like an outsider or other and had to grapple with those concepts. And I had the privilege of meeting the founder of Dragonfly at a random graduate consulting club discussion that I was leading, talking about economics and then career pivots. And nobody had any questions about economics afterwards, and everybody wanted to know about career pivots, which is also a great thing to have a mentor for, and I've benefited from in my own approach. So with that, let's begin this discussion of mentoring is a two-way street. And if you were to look up a basic definition of mentoring, you would see something like where a more experienced individual works with a less experienced individual to facilitate and accelerate their development and advancement. Pretty cut and dry. If that's all you ever did, it could be a very transactional relationship. I know some mentoring programs emphasize set SMART goals at the beginning and meet once a month and check these boxes. And those types of mentoring relationships can get you really good advice, but it might not be very much of a two-way street. The mentoring up phrase that was used by Fatima. And in addition to that, they're probably not going to be transformational. Because just a page later in the textbook that talks about that very basic definition of mentoring, the authors then talk about how a high quality mentoring relationship can be transformational, both for the person doing the mentoring and the person receiving the mentoring. And so what I'm going to talk about is my experience in mentoring in a relationship that's a two-way street, or as one of my mentees used the phrase, mentoring where everybody's on the same level, and how that can be a transformational and transformative relationship for both parties in the mentoring relationship, and what you can do to facilitate that if that is your goal. So we have a variety, I'm sure, of stakeholders listening to this presentation today. I'm sure some of you are new to mentoring or being mentored and looking for some advice and some answers. I would imagine others have had experience already, either receiving mentoring or giving the mentoring, and are looking for some new ideas, new perspective, how they can work things in. And I hope that everyone who's listening today has the opportunity to gain something from this discussion. So I find that the best way to talk about mentoring is to start with an anecdote. This is going to be an extended anecdote that then pulls together a lot of the concepts that you'll see later. So I want you to meet Rachel. Rachel was one of my earliest mentees through a formal matching program at the Penn State Schreier Honors College. So I was introduced to her in the spring of 2009 as a potential person to mentor. And this photo is 9 years later. We met in 2018 once she was well established at a job in Washington, D.C. And we'd stuck together through all that time, and we are still in a very productive two-way mentoring relationship that I look forward to telling you a little bit more about and then deriving some lessons from that. So when we first met, this is two pictures, one of the Honors College dorm and administrative offices at Penn State, and then one of the creamery at Penn State where you can get some amazing ice cream. So the very first time I met Rachel, we took a walk from the classroom building where I met her to the creamery. And at least I got some ice cream to snack on while we were chatting. And they have some nice benches outside, and we were talking about what her double major was, and she was in biobehavioral health and music composition. And she also told me that she wanted to go to medical school after her undergrad. So thinking about her goals and thinking about, what would I do with those? I thought for a moment and I posed the question, well, is one of those something you really want to do for your career and the other one is just a passion? And then I paused and reflected for a moment and said, or maybe you'd like to open a practice in music therapy someday. Now that offhanded, somewhat out of left field suggestion really caught her attention. She knew at that time that what she would later come to call junctional thinking was something that I understood. And the term junctional thinking came from a podcast for which she was interviewed and has to do with the ability to hold two very different ideas in your head and find some way to integrate them. And the fact that I took her seriously and thought about how she might synthesize this appealed to her very much. So sitting there in that first discussion, I was already able to demonstrate to her what I thought was part of my job in the very earliest moments of a mentoring relationship. First, I had to listen authentically, treat her as her authentic self, be myself, think about what I might say as a result. I didn't list it on this slide, but I certainly didn't speak over her. I took whatever she said absolutely seriously. I synthesized without judgment. And that's really key, but going into something without ideas, but then applying my wisdom and judgment after some reflection to offer some ideas about how she might build on the set of ideas she came to the table with. And as Rachel and I started our mentoring relationship, each of us had had other experiences with assigned mentor matches previously. And we knew that sometimes those work and sometimes those don't. And of course, one of the ideas from a discussion like this is to give you some pointers on how you, either as the mentor or the mentee, can facilitate and maximize the probability of success. In our case, we were fortunately both open to seeing what might develop in an authentic and vulnerable interpersonal relationship. We both knew from that very first in-person meeting where we had this exchange of ideas that there was a spark that had the potential to make this a long-lasting and very rewarding and transformational mentoring relationship, rather than one in which we were just going to check boxes and say, yes, we met 4 times during the academic year and demonstrated simply that we could follow directions. So let's fast forward in Rachel's life and look at a few milestones that she had and what the mentoring relationship meant beyond that. She graduated from Penn State, didn't go on to go to medical school, but instead went to a master's program at the University of Pennsylvania. And we stayed in touch throughout that, and she sent me some of her graduation materials from the University of Pennsylvania program. She was considering further graduate studies and having difficulty finding a good fit in her first full-time job. And we continued to have discussions throughout to talk about pointers on positioning oneself when a person has the degree but not the experience, and questions of what might she be willing to do in order to, land that first job and help herself along. She went so far as taking an unpaid internship at the United Nations, difficult way to live in New York City, and we stayed in touch throughout that time as she was trying to figure out how to position herself and to build her own career for what came next. And then finally, she had an opportunity to work for the organization called Academy Health, where she still works to this day, which is a professional association for health services researchers. And we've remained in touch throughout that time. Now, she continued to develop professionally. She reached the level of director at Academy Health before she turned 30. She had personal relationships, and some of them worked, and some of them didn't work so well. And no, she didn't share every last detail of those with me. But she shared enough with me that I could understand how her personal life and professional life were intertwined, and how challenges to her personal life were affecting her professional life. And knowing that was helpful because then I could give her advice to how to think about trade-offs she might make, decisions she might make, and posing the challenges in her own life that she had to face. So she continued to think about further study, and she eventually applied for and received a Fulbright to go to Cote d'Ivoire. Unfortunately, she went there in the spring of 2020, and she didn't end up staying for as long as she thought she was going to, which was a rather crushing experience for her, and she felt like her world was crashing down. So now she's had the time during the pandemic to do some re-examination, and throughout it all, we've been in touch, lots of emails, some texts, in person when we can, and lots of Zoom in the past year and a half. All examples of our approach might be different from other people's approaches, but keys to understanding frequency of communication, types of communication, openness of communication, all of which will be important for these transformative mentoring relationships. Now, mentoring's this is whole predicated discussion on mentoring being a two-way street. So let's look at the anecdote and think about the different roles that I played in guiding Rachel at the different stages of her professional development and advancement. So I listened authentically and with patience to hear about her story, and listening not just authentically and with patience, but also without judgment to her dreams, her ideas, and her struggles, so that I could then think about what I knew about her story already, integrate the new information that she would share into what I already knew, and then provide feedback to her in a way that was consistently reflective to ensure that I understood what she had in mind when she spoke to me. And we're going to talk about active listening, although I know Dragonfly, as was mentioned earlier, has its own programs about active listening. So moving on from that, prompting is also very important. I would give her little nudges. I would say, you might want to consider this or this. Never tell her what to choose, but always giving her suggestions and perspectives that she might not have otherwise on those suggestions. Giving her access to my network. One of the things that I love to do and that I think is integral to a mentoring experience is for the mentor to provide access to their network for the person they're mentoring, so that the person they're mentoring can hear about other people's experiences, other people's successes, other people's career paths, and opportunities that they may have. And one other form of support was when Rachel was trying to assess what she might do next and just trying to read about programs and people's careers. I said, why don't you call up a few? You know, people are almost always willing to tell you something about their careers if you show a genuine interest and really hear about people's lived experiences. And so that type of support to give her those ideas and encourage her was integral. We can also think about what goes the other direction. So it's easy enough to imagine how the mentor is going to influence the protege or the mentee. But again, we're talking about this being a two-way street. Now, the term either mentoring up, or we also hear about reverse mentoring, it's all over popular culture and management websites and text at this point. Rachel and I would say, have had this from the beginning. So she helped me reconnect, both with the honors program at Penn State and even with my college, which was the College of Health and Human Development, because she was in a major that didn't even exist when I graduated in 1991. And so she gave me perspective on things that I hadn't known about before. And I hadn't thought about junctional thinking. And so, introducing that concept to me as a concept, although I always like to think about how things are interconnected, she was able to introduce me to people who think this is a big deal, and the value that it created for me and the value that it could create for the people I mentor. So there was definitely learning going on. She also provided insights to me as I went along. I was able to gain from her these ideas of junctional thinking and how that could help other proteges that I have. In addition to insights when she was looking for that job and having difficulty finding it despite having a master's degree, how that could inform my mentoring of other individuals. Honing skills, I certainly had the opportunity to work on my mentoring skills, work on my reflection skills, work on my storytelling skills as I wrote reference letter after reference letter for her for different things that she applied for. And I was always delighted to do that for her because I saw nothing but her success. And then I got flattered immensely when at a mentoring dinner, she talked about my mentoring after I gave a keynote at a Penn State event. So, I wrote her a recommendation for the Fulbright. She made favorable comments when she was added to the Hall of Fame for her master's program. And so it's always interesting getting her perspective on things. Sometimes in the moment, sometimes years later. This spring, we had a fireside chat talking about our 12 years of mentoring experience for other Penn State alumni and students. And I found out some things about the earliest parts of our mentoring relationship that I'd never heard her say before. And so getting that perspective on my mentoring and how I can continue to improve it, just like an industrial process, continual quality improvement, is something that I find very, very important. And then finally, she's opened doors for me in the same way that I've opened doors for her, getting me back in touch with the organization that she works for. That was my initial place to go to, given my own training in health economics and health services research, that I'd stepped away from for some years. And then she got me back in touch to participate in one of their major initiatives. And she has shared with me how much my participation was appreciated. When we're developing a mentoring relationship, I think every individual needs a narrative, not only explaining what's happened in the past in their lives, but also thinking about looking ahead. What is going forward in their lives going to look like? That, to me, is really important. And a mentoring relationship should have a narrative as well. So the narrative that Rachel and I have built up is one where she had to take certain actions as a protege. I had to take a certain approach as a mentor in order to achieve this transformational and transformative two-way street approach to mentoring. She had to be willing to listen to and incorporate my ideas to the extent that she found them relevant. She was also perfectly able to say, this doesn't quite make sense for me. Do you have any other thoughts on this? If that was the most appropriate thing for her to say. I had to be able to create a safe space. And we heard about safe spaces when Fatima was talking and the importance of those safe spaces so that she could be her authentic self. Well, why did she sign up for biobehavioral health and music composition initially? What was motivating her to go on each step of her career path? And why does she want to go next into human rights and justice and public health as a combination? I had to remember that I wasn't trying to create what they call a mini me. Now, she ended up in a field closer to where I started out than I ever thought she might have. But the goal was never to create someone who was just like me. It was to get Rachel to realize her best personal narrative as she went along. I also had to be humble. I've successfully mentored a number of women. In fact, when I talk about more than just one mentee, it's almost always all women that I talk about who I've successfully mentored. And there are many things on which I can mentor them. What I can't tell them is, have you ever had to deal with this issue being viewed as a woman in the workplace, in the community, or whatever? And so I will often have to say, I can get you this far in the discussion, but for that next question you have, I'm going to have to refer you to someone else. And that's where access to the rest of my network becomes really important. And I've got to be humble and vulnerable. I need to share not only my successes, but where I've had missteps and failures and challenges in my own career, because I've learned from them. And I want to share with the people I'm mentoring how they can learn from them as well. So my goal, again, has always been to help my protege identify who she is, to grow her network, and to embrace a hopeful future moving in the direction of the narrative that she envisions for herself. So let's think about how we get there. To begin with, I recommend that people think about what is their own style of mentoring or receiving mentoring. Now, you can probably tell from the compliments that I've gotten and some of the things even that Akil said, that when I'm doing mentoring or I'm talking to a group, I'm going to jump in head first. I'm going to tell people about, give people as open and as familiar a conversation as I can from the get-go, judging how they feel about that familiarity as well. I'm going to talk about my professional career. I'm going to talk about what worked and what didn't if we have time. I'm going to tell them a few things about my personal life. I've got a wife. I've got 3 sons. I'm an active runner. I love to bake. And I love to write poetry. And I'm going to bring those into the conversation because they're relevant to how I live my life on a day-to-day basis. And it provides a bigger context. And I want the people I mentor to feel like they can share with me that they want to talk about the bigger context as well. Now, will every person be as willing to jump in headfirst as me? Absolutely not. And that's okay. But that's where thinking about boundaries becomes important. Are there topics that are permanently out of bounds, temporarily out of bounds? Do you agree that both the mentor and mentee can say, well, normally we could talk about that, but right now it's a little sensitive, so I want to back off? All of those are important. How do you approach vulnerable topics? How do you think about them? How do you interact with people in general before you start this mentoring relationship? I think it's also important to recognize that mentoring style is not a one and done decision. We all evolve, and maybe not on a year-over-year basis, although I've had quite a past year in terms of my own personal and professional development, but certainly over a 3 to 5 year period, that was the way I used to interact with people. Is there something that has fundamentally changed? And again, I think that the earlier you can set and be clear about what those boundaries are, the better. And Rachel and I, as I mentioned, I mean, she's talked about some pretty sensitive personal issues with me, but there's sometimes when she just wasn't willing to go any further. And my ability to sense that, or more importantly, her feeling that if she had to, she could say, please, I don't want to talk about that right now, is important to understanding how to relate to someone through thick and thin over time. I'm not going to read all 10 of these, and I'm not going to say that I am perfect at all 10 of them, or that you need to be perfect at all 10 of them as a mentor or mentee. But these are 10 things that if you keep in the back of your mind can help to achieve a more likely to be transformative and transformational mentoring experience. So let's talk about them individually. So we can start with active listening. Again, this is something that Dragonfly, in particular, thinking about mental health, is keen on. And there are some formal definitions, but in my own work, I think of it as listening in a way in which all these things are true. It's clear that the speaker has my full attention, minimal talking over, ideally none, but it happens every once in a while. The person doing the listening will ask questions for clarification. They'll offer a summary back to the speaker at logical points, just trying to say, is that what you meant? I want to make sure I understand exactly what you mean. And when they respond, they'll respond reflectively. They'll think about, their bigger issues, their life issues, how it fits together. And that's not to say that I've never responded right off when a mentee has asked a question, but I will often take a moment. And sometimes, as one mentee pointed out, it'll be 2 discussions later that I'll come back to something because I've really needed some time to reflect. While not everyone is as much of an enthusiast about running as I am, let me just use running as an example of how to achieve active listening. There are at least 2 people who I mentor who I run with about once a week. We have an hour. There's no electronic devices. As long as we're safe and don't trip over, some uneven sidewalk on the streets of Baltimore, it's a time when we can pay very good attention to one another and do all the steps in active listening because we need to fill that hour with something other than the sounds of our footsteps. And so again, maybe running is not your thing, but what are the ways that you can remove the distractions and give the person you're listening to your full attention? Empathy, we hear about empathy in terms of leadership and why leaders need to be empathetic, again, all the time these days. It has to do with being able to see things from another person's perspective. There's at least one source that gives 3 different definitions. Cognitive empathy is simply, literally, being able to see the thing from the other person's perspective, but maybe not acting on it. So it's interesting that you could take the perspective, but what are you going to do about it? Emotional empathy is where you take on all of the person's emotions and concerns. And, maybe it's nice to be able to relate to someone that deeply, but does that then set you up to offer your wisdom and experience in a productive way? Compassionate empathy is where you recognize the person's point of view and you're ready to help if and only if needed. And that's where offering some perspective, offering some ideas can be really important. One good example of my participation in compassionate empathy was, working with one of the people I run with, who's also a student in the combined MD PhD program that we have, she wants to be a great physician. She wants to be an excellent health economist. She may do some things in some business ventures, but she also wants a family life. And I could give her all the advice she might want to satisfy those first three. But if I give her advice to satisfy those first three without thinking about the fact that she also wants to have a family life, I might end up giving her fairly bad advice. Boundary setting. So again, key points here. Discuss in advance if at all possible. Permanent or temporary, understand whether it's something you're never going to talk about or just not right now. Are there parts of life? Are there specific topics? Can people figure out some way of signaling to each other without having to come right out and say it? Maybe it's just body language sometime. But the key is, it's very important to set them and respect them from the word go in order to have a relationship that feels as safe as we'd want it to be. Authenticity, another term we hear all the time these days. You must be able to be yourself. What does it mean to be yourself? Understand your values, know how they affect your actions, know how they affect your attitudes and your approach to interaction. I've also read some things, though, that say, well, it's great to let a person be themselves, but you don't want to be stupid about it. And maybe that's a little bit harsh, but I think the key is to recognize while you might take a somewhat libertarian view of just be yourself, you don't want that creating risks for yourself or for others. Also in a diversity sense, and seeing that there was some discussion about diversity both for IEEE and Dragonfly earlier, we want a person to be able to feel they can be their whole selves. Someone from an underrepresented minority group in a mostly white group here in the United States, do they feel they have to act differently and exert effort to do that? A woman in a group of mostly men, an LGBTQ community member in a group that's otherwise making all kinds of heteronormative assumptions. All of those can require extra effort to feel like you're part of a group. I want people to be able to just say, I am myself. I can put all my effort into doing my work or completing my studies. That's what authenticity means to me. One great example is a woman I mentored here in the business school, and she was worried about whether she should talk about her past in modeling and forming a consultancy for other models. And I said, modeling demonstrates you are committed to something. People might say that it's a vanity that you're committed to, but you're committed to something, which you could emphasize the commitment. Developing her own little small business and finding a market. I said any business person would like that. And she was glad that I was able to help her to reframe things, going back to junctionality that we talked about earlier, and to think about how she could be true to herself as she presented herself in the future. Engagement, listen actively, reach out, and be available. And it really is that simple, especially the be available part. One of my Penn State mentees, so she was a woman who came from Bangladesh, went to one of the non-central campuses, and then came to the central campus. Her story was talked about by the dean of the Honors College, and I got in touch with her. And we've developed a relationship where there was never a formal assigned mentorship, but we go back and forth. We text, we send emails, and just checking in on her as she has gone from a biomedical engineering undergrad to a year working at a firm near Baltimore, to then being in a master's program and a PhD program at Brown, and taking the experience that I gave her as mentor to mentee, and now she's mentoring others, showing just as much engagement, particularly with the proactively reaching out, as I showed to her. And I think key here, the engagement has to come from both the mentor and the mentee. The mentee does really need to respond if the mentor is reaching out to them or answering them about something. Empowerment, again, we hear about this in the workplace all the time. Formal definition on the top line there. I think about empowerment in the workplace. If I'm mentoring someone, can I give them power or authority? And in the non-workplace settings, if I'm going to offer you empowerment, am I giving you the tools you need to feel like you are more in control of decisions in the future? And again, an example of yet another student here at the business school. She was just starting her MBA program, looking to make a transition from finance to healthcare, and asking how she should do that. And I gave her some discussion points about transferable skills and how to network to make that transition. And she came away from even our very first discussion feeling like she was in a much better position to make that transition that she hoped for in her career. Connection, it's one of my personal core values. Strengthen a shared connection, connect the people I'm mentoring to others in my network, and then build what I like to call a curated network based on reflective interaction. Who can I introduce this person to that can help them to get a new perspective or some new ideas or some new opportunities? And then how can I help them build on top of that? And so again, just a great example in my own work, another student here at the business school, interested in going into medical school after she got her MBA rather than before, and interested in surgery and emergency departments. So I have within my network a surgeon who also is interested in business, and I could, facilitate her being introduced to that person and having a conversation so that she could get that next piece of vision into what the lived experiences of someone like her might be. Reflection, talked about this a bit already. I think both the mentor and the mentee need to spend time with this. Part of this is the process of active listening and reflecting back to make sure that what you heard was what was intended. But it's also slowing down your reaction time. The choice that you have to respond immediately or think just a little bit before you respond, and how much better informed those responses might be if you do that. And I have another Penn State mentee who went from undergrad directly into a Master of Health Administration, and she wants to stay in the United States. She's not a US citizen. And so the time that I spent really thinking with her, reflecting with her on other students I'd seen who'd presented themselves in ways that helped them stay in the US to work, and then thinking long and hard about the advice that I was giving her was critical to her success. Curiosity. It's really about asking purposeful questions. Of course, people who are looking for mentorship are going to be curious. The mentor should be curious as well. The mentor should think, what do I need to know about this person's experience who I'm mentoring that I don't know right now that would help me to make a better piece of advice, to understand the bigger picture of the decision they're trying to make, and the fact that there is a context for every decision. The key, though, with curiosity, going back to respecting boundaries earlier, is know when it's time to stop, if there is a time to stop. And finally, being non-judgmental, but using judgment in responding. And I think this is critical. Don't give the impression that when either the mentor or the mentee says something, you've already come to a conclusion about whether it's good or not. Listen hard, be reflective, and then use your judgment and wisdom in responding. But, let the person work with the ideas, explore the ideas, and think about how, these new ideas might help them and others around them. So with those 10 ideas, now that you've thought about, okay, here's my style, here's 10 things that if I can, get better at them, they will help to make more likely that my mentor experience will be transformational. How do you find a mentor? Sometimes it's just serendipitous. You interact with somebody multiple times and it starts out as a piece of advice here and a piece of advice there, and then, oh, it's mentoring. Isn't that kind of cool? Other times, and that can happen with, faculty, senior people in your organization, people in the broader professional community, but you can have formal relationships. Sometimes it's formal because it's assigned. Other times it's formal because, there's that star person in your field and you want to get to know them. So, 5 pieces of advice if that's the case and you haven't actually met the person in person. You can look for a piece of their work and write to them about it. Ask them for an informational meeting, just 15 or 30 minutes. Almost everybody's willing to find 15 minutes if you show a true interest in their work and people are just willing to opine and go on about what they enjoy doing. Make sure you come prepared for the meeting so that if you said you wanted to talk about their latest article in a certain journal, you really are ready to talk about it and ask them more questions. When the meeting's done, wait a couple of days, write a thank you note and be very specific about what you're thanking them for. Then propose another meeting. And if you have a couple of these meetings and they go well, you can ask for formal mentorship. How many mentors this idea? I know Fatima was mentioning she had several. I've had several over my career and sometimes several at one time. There's no magic answer to this. The key is value and appreciate each one. The presence of more than one provides multiple perspectives and makes your information set for making decisions much richer. They might come from varying aspects of the decision that you're trying to make. It might be one person for an identity mentor, one person for a general mentor, and one person for a career mentor. That's fine. Sometimes you can find all three of those in the same person. That's great too. The relationships do not need to be, nor really can they be, identical. And does it always need to be called mentoring? The answer to that is no. My closest mentor as an undergrad, who I named a donation after, you look back and you say, Kevin, when we met from 1988 to 1991, I didn't consider a mentor. We were just having interesting conversations. But I can assure you those conversations were mentoring. And so if it does need to be labeled, it does need to be labeled. But you can have all of the principles along regardless of whether you label it so. Few final things. So one, be willing to help mantra. So help, be willing to be honest, be willing to encourage, be willing to learn, and be willing to pay attention. And that's really for both sides of the mentoring relationship. And again, even the mentor needs to learn new things. What's going on in the job market these days? What are issues that younger people are facing in order to be the most effective they can be at helping someone to develop and advance? Often people will ask, well, what's the difference between mentoring and coaching? It's kind of like squares and rectangles, where every square is a rectangle, but not every rectangle is a square. Almost every mentor is going to do some coaching, but coaches aren't necessarily going to be mentors. A few things to think about. Coaching will often be for a specific skill. In the US, we're in the Baseball World Series. If you're having problems batting, you need a batting coach. If the pitcher is off, you need a pitching coach. Two very different skills. It could be multiple skills, but limited in scope. I mentioned that I'm a runner. Sometimes I'll talk to somebody who's both a coach and a nutritionist. Great combination. Still clear what the scope is. And the coach is often going to ask a lot of questions, but not provide answers. They're going to try to get the person they're coaching to come up with the answers themselves. Mentoring, you've heard my talk about being holistic, so I'm going to engage the whole person. I'm going to offer opinions based on my own experience. And I'm going to probably try to get the protege to think a lot more broadly rather than just solving a limited problem. We talked about expectation setting with boundaries. It's also critical to set expectations about communication. What type of communication? Does the mentor use all of email, text, phone, and Zoom? Is there some reason not to use one form for a specific issue? What's going to be the frequency? If you're in a formal program and it says once a month, do you just commit to that once a month and nothing more? Or is there additional outreach? Consistency, particularly if it's a formal program and they say monthly or weekly, try to make sure to hit those. Of course, there's going to be times when they're missed, but if you miss more than one or two, then you really get out of the habit and you lose the strength of the relationship. And openness. How open are you willing to be? Coming back to that boundary setting issue. But again, talk about communication alongside the boundary setting issue early. To match or not to match, as I mentioned earlier, I've mentored women. I've extensively done mentoring within the LGBTQ community as an ally. I've also worked on mentoring some underrepresented minorities. And yes, I have in fact mentored a few white males. Many of those have been serendipitous. Some of them have been matched. Matching programs do tend to focus on demographics and career trajectory. That can be very useful, but there's also research that says that matching on values can be even more important than matching on demographics. And the values is why my mentoring of those diverse populations has worked for me, because I really try to find people to mentor with whom I match on values. Now, not every mentoring story is happily ever after. Obviously, if it gets to a point where it's toxic, end it quickly. If it's simply non-productive, though, you can end it politely. Appreciate the time that they have given. Provide some constructive feedback on what need was not being filled or what wasn't working, because that will help the mentor to then realize, I've got to do this differently in the future. Or if it's the mentor saying it's not being productive, the mentee might realize, if I want to get mentored in the future, I might have to behave a little bit differently. And then give compliments tied to specific interactions. And you might call this an appreciation sandwich, because you appreciate at the beginning and you appreciate at the end, but give that feedback in the middle. Ending a mentoring relationship, either the mentor or the protege can initiate the ending. It's great to commit to at least a year. I know a lot of professional programs, maybe 6 months to start with, but a year is a good time. If you get a 3 to 6 year relationship, that's wonderful. I know I said, I've been mentoring Rachel for 12, but that's the outlier. And after the mentoring relationship, will you be peers and colleagues, or will it just fade away? I never like relationships to just fade away, but you decide what works for you in a relationship. So to conclude, mentoring is a two-way street. I've shown a lot about the back and forth relationship, the growth that can occur for both the mentor and the mentee, the extension of networks, the learning that occurs. But at the end of the day, while I want the learning to go both directions, I want the growth to go both directions, I want the feeling of fulfillment to go both directions, the mentor needs to remember it is about the protege's development. And if you are not serving the protege's development, what are you doing in mentoring? Okay, and that's the protege should remember that as well. So to summarize, it's very important to know your values because that's going to determine a lot of what else goes on in the mentoring relationship, as it really does in every relationship in life. Every decision is made in a context. So mentors need to think about the context of the mentee's decisions. And when the mentees are listening to advice from the mentor's experience, remember the mentors were having a context when they made those decisions. And thinking about the similarity or differences can guide how to take the information from the mentor's experience and apply it to the mentee's life. Mentoring, like much of life, is a team sport. You probably need more than one. And in filling those gaps in skills or knowledge or experience, you almost definitely are going to need more than one to get a big picture. And finally, while again, it's great to have long-term mentoring relationships, no relationship is guaranteed to be forever. But if you think about your values, your approach to working with people, communicate early and often about expectations, and follow the other steps to building a holistic relationship with another individual who's interested in your success, you too can have a transformational mentoring relationship. And thank you for listening to this talk about mentoring as a two-way street.